Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our U.S. Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. Today is Sunday, June 7th, 2026. And as we head into the summer months, it's important to keep up the good work in advancing policies that will hopefully accelerate the arrival of viable longevity treatments and life-saving treatments for patients who are suffering from terrible diseases. And there are still many of those. They take thousands of lives every single day, and yet science is advancing. And there are treatments right now that have not passed the full review process of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, and yet can save lives if they are provided to patients in time. And hence, a large focus of our discussions in the recent past has been on the concept of right to try or freedom to try. For those who recall our salon of May 24th, we had Dan Montano, the CEO of Genesis Medicine, on as a guest, and he is an advocate of a ballot initiative in the state of Nevada called Freedom to Try Medical Innovations for Nevada. So today we are going to continue our discussion on how to afford greater access for patients to investigational treatments. Joining us is our panel of U.S. Transhumanist Party officers, including our Director of Community and Citizen Science, Daniel Tweed, and our Director of Visual Art, Art Ramon Garcia. And our special guest today is Stephen Martin. Stephen advocates for and gets patients treatment using state laws that enable right to try. He is the U.S. expansion lead and advisor for Infinita City and a co-founder of GenePool Technologies, an organization that facilitates patent pooling and licensing in the cannabis industry. He importantly has played a crucial role in helping to realize the promise of Montana's expanded right to try law, which is Senate Bill 535, enacted in 2025. He actually helps get real patients access to treatments under the right to try law. So he's there on the front lines helping to save people's lives. And as part of the motivation for this salon, I'd like to share two articles by Stephen. First of all, this one published in the Infinita City Times, Why You Can't Use Your Right to Try. So what are some of the practical obstacles to patients getting treatments under both federal and state right to try laws, even where those laws have been implemented? And a second post, this is time sensitive, is entitled, Please Let Us Treat Brody DeVault. This is a 3-year-old child who has a life-threatening condition who could benefit from what is called federal enforcement discretion that Stephen will explain in greater detail. So Stephen, you have a fascinating presentation prepared for us. So please proceed. You have the floor.
Sure. Thanks, Gennady. Nice to meet everybody, and thank you everybody for taking the time to hear me out on this niche but very critical issue. So what I'll do is I'll just kind of run through the presentation. It does include an introduction of who I am, and at the end of that, we'll just kind of take some questions. So can you guys see the presentation? Okay, everything coming through?
Yes.
All right, great. So FDA enforcement discretion, right to try, and what we call Q-stars. This presentation is going to detail kind of the evolving landscape of state laws and how they interact with federal regulations. and kind of explain both what the current opportunities for patients are, what the blockers are due to a disharmony between federal and state level regulations, and how we propose to solve that and what we're doing about that. So before we begin, as I was introduced, my name is Stephen Martin. I am the U.S. lead at Infinita. In addition to helping advocate and pass state laws like we did in Montana and like we recently were able to do with one of two proposed bills in New Hampshire, I do also work in discussing with folks at the federal level, FDA and HHS, how to harmonize regulations, raising awareness in the Senate. And I actually run our commercial operations out here in Montana. We have a review board for the state law, and I help both biotechs, patients, and clinics figure out how to actually get to market in Montana. So with that being said, let me pause and just kind of give everyone who is watching a sort of brief history of the timeline with Right to Try. This will cover both federal and state laws. So the trend began in 2014 with Colorado, of various states passing their own right to try laws. Now, at the time, and I think this is true today, the vast majority of states which were passing right to try laws had a very narrow interpretation of the bill that said basically terminal or serious illness only. These are usually a little vaguely defined. How do you know when an illness is terminal versus when it isn't? The general rule of thumb is that most of these laws require that a physician signs on to stating you are going to likely die in the next 6 months. But the general argument behind these right to try laws is if you're going to die in the next 6 months and there are no FDA approved treatments which are available that have a real chance of preventing you from dying, you should have exactly what the name is, a right to try. You should not be told at that point that you can't try a drug because it's not safe enough, right? You're going to die in 6 months. That just does not really make any sense. Nor should you be told that you can't try a drug because it might not be efficacious. You're going to die in 6 months. You should have the right to take that gamble. So this legislative trend of various states passing laws to this effect began in 2014 with Colorado. Probably the most notable passage after that was the passage of the law in Texas, which actually started to see like a decent amount of usage, right? However, something that you should understand about when states pass these laws, federal law has supremacy in the United States. Every single treatment which has ever been administered under a state program was doing so in violation of federal regulations and federal laws. So there was kind of this outstanding question, and it's still a problem today, of, all right, FDA and HHS have the authority to go into anybody treating patients under these state laws and theoretically charge them with federal crimes, right? However, there was a very clear, observable trend of widely publicized cases or clinics that were advertising their activities, and FDA and HHS just not really doing anything. This is what we would call the practice of enforcement discretion. Federal agencies which are charged with enforcing the law have limited resources. They don't have infinite money. They don't have infinite time. They don't have infinite numbers of employees. And they have to decide where they will and will not spend those resources in terms of prioritizing what to enforce. And oftentimes this comes down to what is practical to enforce. It might be too costly, but sometimes it comes down to, well, there is the letter of the law, but we don't think it is within the spirit of a given regulation or law to go spend our resources, in this example, shutting down companies who are trying to give treatment to terminally ill cancer patients, right? So these state laws kind of existed in this very weird legal twilight where it was pretty clear they weren't going to get cracked down on by federal authorities, but at the same time, they were not technically federally legal, and there was no HHS or FDA policy regarding enforcement discretion. So in 2016, Senator Ron Johnson, who was at the time the head of a pretty large committee on the Senate, I'm not sure if he still is or not, but he began sending letters to the FDA and to HHS asking them to officially, state what their stance is on all of these various state laws. If a doctor or if a manufacturer tries to treat a patient under Texas right to try, for example, will the FDA or will HHS go after them, or will they exercise enforcement discretion? FDA and HHS did not answer his letters, period. And eventually they were summoned in front of the Senate. One of the two people who was summoned refused to come to the meeting. The other one did come to the meeting, but when they were asked about this directly, their statement was, I can't really speak to what enforcement action we might take. And that sort of solidified the reality here, which is all of this exists in a state of regulatory uncertainty. Now, this regulatory uncertainty, as we'll talk about later, is a real problem for getting adoption of these programs, but there are some providers who are willing to look at FDA and HHS's actual history of non-enforcement here and utilize these programs. One such provider, and probably the single most high-profile case of a state right to try law ever being used, was a man by the name of Dr. Del Passant. Now, he was treating, I believe, glioblastoma patients. I'm not sure, but it was some sort of very terminally ill cancer. And his drug was right at the benchmark of pre-approval. So I think he had finished his phase 3 trial already, but it was going to be many months, possibly even a year, until the FDA officially approved his treatment for use. And he had numerous patients at that time who, if they had to wait that long, they were just going to die, period. Now, Dr. Del Passant, I mean, he took an enormous risk because his company had raised probably hundreds of millions of dollars. And he basically said to the FDA, even though I'm right on the cusp of you approving my drug, of finally being able to get my investors a return, I'm not willing to sentence these patients to death. And so I am going to break federal law. I am going to use Texas right to try. And he treated 75 patients using his treatment. The case was pretty viral at the time, so it's not as though the FDA was not aware of what he was doing. And certainly senators were aware of it because it was kind of used as the onus to pass the federal right to try law. But ultimately, the FDA not only did not enforce against him, they actually granted his treatment breakthrough status and then approved it on an accelerated timeline, right? So this is a reinforcement of this trend of like FDA will not, officially renounce the right to enforce, but even if you really box them in and make it impossible for them to deny that they're aware of something going on, they are clearly not taking the opportunities to enforce. But this example served as the onus which pushed Senator Johnson to get President Trump to sign the Federal Right to Try Act into law. That was a great step forward for patients' rights, although it's not a perfect law, as we'll talk later. But in the interim years, in the 8 years since that has happened, states have continued to pass their own various laws. Some of these are broadened right to try laws, like what we have in Montana or out in New Hampshire, which is a little more limited, but still broader than the federal statute. Some of these are state level stem cell laws. Those are in a number of states. And more recently, there's been a broad trend of right to personalized treatment laws, which are, laws that deal with usually things like gene therapies and cancer vaccines, which are now passed in more than 18 states. But let's pivot for a second and talk about the reality of using the federal laws. So the top chart here, this is how many expanded access protocols the FDA will approve in a given year. You can see a brief spike during COVID where it goes up to about 8,000 protocols. But then beyond that, normally FDA will approve ballpark like 2,000 in a year, right? Expanded access is very similar to right to try. There's a little bit more of an involved process, but this is the more commonly used federal program. Now, below that, we don't have direct numbers from the FDA for how many right to try requests have been reviewed, but we do know how many biotechs have cited data from their right to try usages in their drug applications to the FDA. And ballpark, over the last 8 years, it's been about 21. 21 companies have cited that over the last 8 years, which means even if we assume pretty hefty multiples, we're probably looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of 5,000 or 6,000 people being treated per year with expanded access and federal right to try combined. Now, for reference, the number of people in America who qualify, who have a serious or terminal illness, as is defined in the federal statute, is estimated at somewhere around 13 million people. So that delta, that huge gap between the number of people who should be able to access this treatment or these treatments through these pathways and who are actually able to is enormous. And one thing I'd like to address here, this is not because the FDA is denying requests. The FDA effectively rubber stamps all expanded access requests. It's like a 99% approval rate, and it's usually done within 24 hours of application. With right to try, it's even stronger than that. You don't need the FDA's approval at all. You submit the application, you notify them that you are treating patients, and that's it. FDA couldn't stop you even if they wanted to, right? So FDA is not the blocker here. So why aren't there treatments available? Why are there so few people who are able to get treatments using these programs, even though 13 million people should qualify? The answer is that biotechs, manufacturers, the companies who need to provide these treatments for use aren't using these programs. So why? This boils down to a simple risk-reward equation. Whenever you treat a patient pre-approval, you are taking certain risks. There is the risk that something goes wrong and the FDA starts scrutinizing you more carefully. They are statutorily barred from doing this, but it is a risk nonetheless. It might be unofficial, but maybe some examiner who is like reviewing your drug kind of hears about something, and they're never going to write down they're using that data, but it's kind of biasing them, right? This is something that companies are worried about, even though, for the record, the FDA has been very good about trying to make sure that that doesn't happen in reality. There's just things that you can't really control there, right? There's the risk of a lawsuit. You do have legal liability protections, but nothing stops someone from suing you, and even getting a lawsuit dismissed costs us money. And more importantly, even if you win your lawsuit, and this is the real important risk here, there is a risk of bad PR. Someone has an adverse event, someone gets hurt or something like that, and it's a headline, that could be catastrophic for your company. And this is particularly relevant because a lot of the time when you're treating patients in expanded access or right to try scenarios, you're dealing with patients who are probably going to die or probably going to have some sort of terrible outcome. So this risk is like quite high, like something bad really could happen. And if some reporter writes about it, what might happen is that the next time you need to raise funds, which is like a critical, it is a life or death thing for these biotechs, you might have trouble because you're competing against companies that didn't take the risk of providing pre-approval access, that carefully controlled every single administration of the drug in a clinical trial setting. And so they won't have those bad headlines. And so your competitor biotechs who are going to the same investor pool as you, they will not be disadvantaged the way you were because you did the right thing. All of this combines to create a kind of like very risk heavy atmosphere, which is why we've heard from a lot of biotechs that like they would like to do expanded access. They would like to do right to try, but the problem is their investors or their board will like basically mutiny or they'll crucify them if they try, because you're taking all of this risk. And normally if you're going to take that risk, you expect some sort of reward to offset it. But actually, these federal programs require that you charge like at cost, which is basically like the cost of the drug plus shipping. But in reality, there's going to be a bunch of costs you can't really make back. So you're actually going to lose money for every single patient that you treat under one of these programs. So you're taking all of this enormous risk for your company, and you're not even doing so to like break even or get some moderate reward. You're doing it at a cost. You're doing it at a loss. That is what our entire federal patient access system depends on. And that is why, to just go back to the numbers here, there's a 13 million large potential patient pool here, and we're treating maybe a few thousand patients a year. So we've seen that the federal systems just don't really work that well despite good intentions, right? We've also seen that the state level programs have seen some adoption. What you're seeing here is a map of what I call Q stars. These are qualified state therapeutics access regimes. This is not just right to try laws for terminal illness. It's not even just broadened right to try laws like we have in Montana and New Hampshire, but it's also stem cell laws and personalized treatment laws. What you can see here is that the vast majority of the United States at this point has some sort of qualified state therapeutics access regime, right? This is reflecting an intent from the American people to have the states step up and catch the patients who fall through the cracks in the federal access pathways. whether that's because the patients themselves don't qualify, they might have a chronic issue that isn't technically terminal, so they don't get to access their treatment, or whether it's because the risk-reward profile of the federal pathways is just so poor that no one can really access medicine through the federal pathways. There is this obvious demand from the American people to have their state legislatures step up to the plate and get them medicine. But despite the fact that there exists this de facto regulator enforcement discretion, it's very hard to actually utilize one of these state programs. And I'm saying that as one of the only people who has actually successfully done so in the past. Let's talk briefly about the FDA's actual history of enforcement discretion here, right? I already told you about Dr. Del Passand, right? So this is a case where FDA not only did not enforce against a high-profile doctor and a biotech using one of these programs, they actually basically supported them, right? None of it was ever written down, but when you get given priority breakthrough status like he was, that is the FDA throwing its support behind a drug. And if we actually look at the enforcement trend of the FDA and HHS against companies using state programs, the number is a big whopping 0. It has been 8 years since the federal right to try law passed, right? Now, in 2018, just before the passage of the law, there was a congressional report that showed there has never been a case at that time, this was 2018, where the FDA actually challenged the authority of a state law or actually went after a company that was treating patients utilizing a state law. That is still true today. It has been 8 years. It has been multiple presidential administrations. FDA turnover, HHS turnover has been, especially in recent time, like quite substantial. And yet, despite leadership changes, despite changes in administration, the FDA and HHS has never actually gone after a company for treating a patient under a state stem cell program or personalized treatment program or right to try program, period. They are not enforcing against Q stars. But all of that enforcement discretion, despite being very obvious if you look at the historical record, is unwritten. And there are providers, like I work with some of them, who are willing to come treat patients based on this unwritten policy, because at this point, it's got like a decade of precedent behind it. But there are also providers who won't. There are providers who are too risk sensitive, and they'll say it doesn't matter how obvious the historical trend is here, we simply cannot justify it. And this kind of goes back to what I was saying with like the investors and the boards. It's not enough to want to treat patients. You have to have it de-risked and you have to have upside for participating. So where I primarily work out of is Montana SB 535, where we have been able to get some treatments. And we will be starting to, I think, sometime either later this month or next month, treat patients under the state program. Here's what's different about Montana compared to like bog standard right to try laws. One, we do not require that a patient proves they are terminally ill. This is actually quite important because there's a lot of treatments like, for example, cancer vaccines, where you may not qualify as terminally ill despite being at a serious risk of dying. If someone wants to ask about specific cases later, I can share some details on this, but we have one case in particular where a man had prostate cancer, had his tumor removed, and then did genetic profiling on the tumor and found that he is at extraordinarily high risk for his cancer coming back, right? Now, because he has had the surgery to have his tumor removed, he no longer qualifies as terminally ill. So he cannot use any state law or federal law that requires that a doctor sign a statement saying he's likely to die in the next 6 months. Despite that, he has somewhere between an 8 to 15% chance of becoming terminally ill over the next 3 to 5 years. He can access a treatment which has been used to treat hundreds of patients overseas and has already finished phase 2 studies that has so far shown a solid likelihood of reducing that down to 5%. But again, he can't under federal or most state laws. He can in Montana. It is a single injection, right? Now, the second thing about Montana SB 535 is it's any post-phase 1 treatment. When I say any, that means that it does not necessarily have to have had its phase 1 done in the United States. That's actually a big difference. If you look at drug development economic trends, what you'll find is that a lot of phase 1 studies are moving overseas to places like Australia or Japan. The economics of it just makes it far more sensible to do that. But that requirement that a phase 1 has to have been done in the United States is actually putting a lot of treatments out of reach of federal and state pathways. Montana was designed to fix that problem. The third thing, we have our own dedicated review boards in Montana. Often, patients would be able to access something using federal right to try or state bills, but institutional review boards, IRBs who oversee clinical trials, didn't want to consider it. And then similarly, we have our own dedicated clinics because, again, there was a problem where patients would have trouble finding doctors willing to use these programs. So by having our own separate facilities for this, both at the review board and clinic level, we're able to make it far easier for patients to actually get treatment and for biotechs to like get through that process of having a treatment reviewed, approved, and actually administered. But perhaps the most important change, if I had to pick one thing that is more important than anything else, is that we do not require the providers charge at cost, right? This is the single thing which has allowed us to get biotechs interested in Montana. If you come here, you will not be losing money treating every single patient. Everything is still out of pocket and at cost, and that does mean sometimes the treatments are just priced out of coming to Montana. It's an unfortunate reality. But it is possible for companies to economically justify taking the risk of coming here. So, with that being said, the big problem with Montana and why we have a limited selection, not zero, but a limited selection of treatments that are willing to come here is that we can only right now work with biotechs and companies who are willing to operate on this long history of unwritten enforcement discretion. This is a lot of companies who, maybe they're using repurposed drugs, so they're very skeptical that they will get the $1 to $2 billion needed to get to full FDA approval anyways. So they're just like a little more risk tolerant because they kind of think, well, what else are we going to do, right? These are companies who sometimes have trouble because there exists no clinical trial structure which works for them. Sometimes, like, this is a lot of personalized treatment stuff because, again, it's kind of impossible to do clinical trials. It's impossible to recruit enough patients when you just don't have that large of a patient pool. And the FDA is working on something for that, but they've been like working on it for years, right? So a lot of these companies are willing to take that risk, but we cannot work with providers who need the written assurances yet. So what we are doing now, we're meeting with the FDA on June 16th. We have also been engaging with folks at HHS, and we've met with a number of senators, and we have spoken with the Domestic Policy Council at the White House. We are effectively asking for the FDA to not even change their behavior in any sense. We're asking for them to keep doing what they've been doing for at least 8 years, but we are asking for them to make it official. So we have drafted a enforcement discretion policy around our Q-Star designation. This would not just cover Montana, this would cover every single state program while also ensuring that the FDA maintains things like, adverse event reporting oversight and things like that. So that's kind of the end of my presentation. I have a few other things in the appendix, a few things on drug development economics and stuff, but I figure at this point I'll open it up to a more Q&A style discussion.
Yes, thank you very much, Stephen, for the fascinating presentation. And indeed, before we get into the appendices, let us address some of the viewer questions and remarks. First of all, Charles Wood writes, I'm loving how information dense this presentation is. So to give you an idea of our salon audience and what they prefer. Now, Daniel Tweed observes, it seems sometimes that chilling effects can be more pervasive than legal consequences in terms of the incentives facing companies that fear federal enforcement, even though historically the federal enforcement has been unlikely and did not actually happen to providers of these innovative treatments. Daniel also notes that there's this concept called the legal theory of necessity, and he thinks it ought to supersede the legal theory of supremacy. He says the necessity defense is invoked when a lesser crime is justified to prevent a greater crime. So let's say you're trying to defend somebody from a murderer and there's a storefront and you have to break the window of the storefront because there's a club there and you can hit the murderer over the head and thereby save the person's life. So that would be the necessity defense. And it's interesting how if it came to that, somebody could say, a medical provider could say, well, I saved these people's lives, but hopefully it won't even come to that because, as you mentioned, litigation is expensive. It can be reputationally damaging. It can divert that provider or that organization from the goal of actually developing the treatment further. And along these lines,
Wait,
John.
briefly. Oh, sorry. Can I just comment on one of
Yes,
the things that he said before
of
we
course.
move on? On this whole idea of uncertainty almost being more of a chilling effect than like certain prohibitions, right? This is actually a key point. Normally, I don't use these words because the audience that I'm speaking to won't understand it, but I think perhaps this audience might understand the idea of like a Gensler attractor basin, right? So Gary Gensler was the chairman of the SEC. I can't remember, either under the Obama or Biden administration. I think it was Biden. But he became kind of notorious for never really clarifying any of the SEC stances on anything when it came to crypto, but at the same time making it clear that if you violated some of these unspoken and undefined standards, you would be enforced against, right? Now, the FDA has not gone quite that far because the FDA basically says, we're not going to define the standards. And also, even if you break these unwritten standards, we're probably not even really going to enforce, right? But it is still this kind of chilling effect where because they're unable or unwilling to actually define what the rules are here, because they're unwilling to proactively signal, okay, here is when you could come to a state and we won't come after you. That is almost worse than even if they had put together some sort of really stringent set of requirements and said, like, here is what you have to do. At least if there was some stringent set of requirements, we could go to biotechs and be like, all right, we're going to help you get A, B, and C done. And that way you'll be able to come to Montana, right? But the problem is when there is no A, B, and C, and when they have refused on the record to publish what A, B, and C is, companies look at this and just say, like, listen, man, I got $1 billion of investor capital riding on this. I can't be operating based on like these non-existent unpublished rules. It doesn't matter how clear the historical record is. So what we have to do is make it possible for them, is give them the kind of layup, soften the ground for them to come out and finally provide some set of standards. And that's what a lot of our work has been towards.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Stephen. And our friend John H., who goes by the username More Life Please, is very supportive of making these treatments available to cancer patients or people with serious illnesses that are not fitting into the official definition of a terminal illness. And he also notes, even if one is not at serious risk of imminent death, one might still be facing a dramatically reduced quality of life for months or years to come. And that's a reason to allow people access to experimental treatments, even if they're not likely to die in 6 months. But he does wonder what happened with those 75 cancer patients whom Dr. Ebrahim El-Passand treated because Dr. Del-Passand, because he, of course, set kind of a precedent for offering these treatments to patients right before they received FDA approval. So they likely would have received FDA approval anyway. But the FDA, I think, was very flexible with him because FDA officials knew what would happen to those patients otherwise, and that it was just a matter of timing. But do you know of any follow-up stories about those patients and whether most of them survived, most of them achieved remission or a cure, however one would want to put it?
So I think it's important to be clear about what the standard for success is in these kind of situations, right? When you're dealing with cancer patients who are going to die in the next 6 months, all right, success does not mean 100% survival. Success means more of them survived having got the treatment than would have survived having not gotten the treatment, right? I don't know the exact numbers off of the top of my head, but I do know that Dr. Delpassand and that treatment did meet that standard with these 75 patients. I also know that when people were fighting against the federal right to try law, one senator in particular did say something along the lines of there were 40 deaths out of these 75 patients, right? Or there were 40 like serious adverse events. But that was largely slapped down because everybody who knows anything about treating people in this situation knows, if you hadn't treated them, there would have just been 75 deaths, right? So, I'm hedging here on the numbers to just explain that the raw numbers, absent context, might not sound good, but when you understand the context in which these treatments occur, saving 35 out of 75 people is an enormous success. And that's why I think FDA was able to take that and justify providing that breakthrough status. I also think, frankly, this is the political calculation, and this is part of why, just never publishing any stance is so popular for bureaucrats. I also think that you have to mentally model these bureaucratic organizations not as a single, like, behemoth entity. It's more like a swarm made up of individual bureaucrats, each of whom is first and foremost concerned about themselves. And I think every single person involved in dealing with this case was well aware that if they tried to, enact retribution against Dr. Delpassand's, company while this was going on, they individually would have seen their careers ended, right? So again, I think that this is a good example of the practical realities of what dictates FDA and HHS stances towards these state programs.
Yes, thank you for that answer. And a good parallel to this is the new pancreatic cancer drug, daraxonrasib, to which the FDA granted expanded access approval in 2 days after receiving the application because the results showed a doubling of survival time. So typically, most pancreatic cancer patients die within 6 months of the diagnosis. And in this case, for this drug, most of them lived past 13 months, I believe. And this drug still didn't completely cure most of those patients, per my understanding, but it did extend their lives significantly relative to anything else. And that was considered a success, and a sufficiently notable success that the FDA took this unprecedented step of a very rapid 2-day expanded access approval. And by the way, thank you to John for his support and contribution. As always, he says nice, coherent, comprehensive as to the remarks thus far. So I appreciate that, as do we all. And we have a question from Art Ramon in terms of Native American tribes, nations, reservations, whether those can be potentially sites for this kind of innovation. And Art Ramon points out that there's a Native American reservation that spans both US and Mexican territory. So this is a sovereign nation that has some land in both countries, which creates some interesting legal situations. But Art Ramon, if you'd like to talk about this a bit more and perhaps ask Stephen about some of the possibilities there.
Well, yes, I found out about this years ago when I was suggesting sort of a hyperloop along the border and creating a hub there at the Tohono O'odham Nation. So, yeah, that's something I think that if you really wanted to work around the FDA, that might be the ideal place because it's so gray. It's a native reservation. It's supposedly on both sides of each country. And I think the same thing exists on the Canadian border with the Blackfoot Reservation, or there's another tribe up there. It's almost the same situation. So, in case ever the FDA wants to play hardball, well, just go to these areas and try to work with the native reservations as an alternative. What are your thoughts?
Well, look, so these kind of things have occurred to a lot of people over the years, but there's a reason that none of them have really taken off. And it's kind of the same reason, actually, that the federal laws never really worked out. You can have these laws that provide all of the technical legal protections that you need, but at the end of the day, you have to get the manufacturers to actually make the drug. And then you have to get the biotech that owns the rights to the drug to allow it to be sent and used, right? And these companies categorically will not go around the FDA, right? They will not do anything that might anger the FDA in any sense, because the US is 50% of all healthcare spending, and the big pot of gold at the end of the drug development rainbow for them is getting FDA approval and being able to charge under Medicare, Medicaid, right? This is why everybody bows to the FDA. So, something like a Native American reservation, the company I work for also does a lot of stuff down in Prospera, right? For treatments which are just for economic reasons, and here let me explain this a little bit. For treatments which are just like not viable because of economic reasons, even though they work, that is where you really see a lot of adoption of these, like, kind of, for lack of a better word, like around the FDA programs. Prospera, you could see things abroad in Mexico, right, or in these Native American territories. However, for companies who are still aiming for that final FDA approval, which is like a lot of the more life-saving cancer type stuff, you're just not going to see that adoption, because it's not realistic to manufacture these drugs in any one territory. You have to have like distributed manufacturing in large, like multi-million-dollar facilities. And it's not realistic to think that these companies will opt into doing anything that might anger the FDA. You need FDA cooperation and buy-in to some extent, right? Now, what I show here in this slide, right, this is kind of a very easy mental model of what the economics of current drug development looks like. You have this potential pool of all these treatments that work, as in there is improved efficacy, or there's equal efficacy to something that exists, but there is an improved safety profile, right? That is the large circle there. But then these companies need to raise at least $1 billion, right? So you have to shrink that circle. So any investor who is going to give them money needs to be able to say, I can give you $1 billion and you're going to return me. There's some probability you're going to return me more than $1 billion, right? And that needs to be, I didn't include all the math here, but if we had a simple, like 2 or 20 or 30% ROI, that would bring it to $1.3 billion, right? But it's not even that simple, because it takes time to get through this drug approval process. That eats into your patent life, right? That's when you have exclusive pricing power, is when you have that patent life. At the end of the approval process, you can extend your patent life by 5 years, but the actual approval process is about 10 years. So even very optimistically, you're going to shrink your patent life down to 15 years. So the only treatments which can currently get investment are things that work and will make a profit on $1 billion, at least $1.3 billion. In fact, it's probably much higher than that, and do all of that within 15 years, right? That is the current landscape. Now, if we had more competition, if Q stars can actually function, then the economics very drastically change, right? First of all, you don't have to necessarily raise $1 billion to start earning cash flow on your treatment. You could raise $8 million and spend 3 years and do a phase 1 study, and then immediately roll out into these smaller cash-only state-level markets. And that means that you actually only need to be able to justify earning about $10 million in 17 years. So that pool, that like section of the Venn diagram within the overall pool of drugs that work, becomes substantially larger. And this is how Q stars, this is how more competition among treatment availability markets makes drugs more investable.
Yes, thank you for that response, and the diagrams provide quite a helpful contrast. Now, along these lines, one question that's interesting to consider is, what distinguishes the providers who will insist on the written assurances from the ones that are willing to rely on unwritten enforcement discretion? So you mentioned it's essentially a cultural outlook within those organizations, and sometimes it's not up to the CEO or the product development team. They may actually be willing to help the patient, but the boards, the investors. So is it an incentive issue? The boards and the investors might not see any potential benefit. Even if the drug saves a life, they might think, well, that's nice, but it won't bring a financial return. But they do see the risk. But what distinguishes those kinds of actors from the ones that say, well, we know the history of FDA non-enforcement, and we're willing to take that chance because we don't think the FDA will go after us, but we think there might be a possibility of a benefit if we show that the drug really does save some lives?
Yeah. So the way that I'll explain this is I'll kind of outline the profile of who so far is willing to come to Montana. Because to be clear, there are companies, but it is a minority of companies right now, right? So what we typically see is a few different things. One, we see companies who, even if their drugs work, I mean, you can look, at this economics breakdown, right? We see companies who are maybe in this outside circle of they know their treatment works. They've got clinical studies, they've got solid biomechanics, but they also know the economics make their drug uninvestable because they will never return a profit on $1 billion investment. They will never do that in 15 years, right? And so they're looking at a situation where it's like, we've got our phase 1, maybe phase 2 data. Maybe it's even a repurposed drug. So it's already been proven to be like enormously safe. Like we have a drug that's repurposed after 40 years of use for a different indication, right? The safety is a total non-question, right? But this company also knows it's never going to raise $1 billion or $2 billion because it's never going to be able to promise returning that investor capital. So for these guys, they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. And that's why it's very easy for them to justify taking this risk. Because if they don't take this risk, they're dead, right? And in a sense, their situation, if you think about it, kind of parallels the patients who are trying to access treatment under right to try, right? It's a very similar risk-reward calculation. Their risk is essentially 100% if they do nothing. So why not? Why not come to Montana, right? We do also see companies who, because their treatment does not have a good clinical trial structure, are not really confident they're going to be able to get through the approval process, at least not fast enough, even if they could raise the money. So I won't name the company specifically, but we have one company that does a treatment which would be different for each bone or joint, right? It is the same overall treatment, but the FDA's stance is that they need to do a clinical trial for each different bone or joint. Now, if you know anything about the cost of clinical trials, this means they would need to raise something in the neighborhood of $250 billion in order to actually get their treatment fully to market so that you could use it anywhere in the human body. They have largely given up on coming to the US. They have been treating patients overseas for years. They have gotten phase 1 clinical trial results on several different joints and bones, but they have completely given up on ever going through the full clinical approval process because the numbers, I mean, they would have to effectively like raise the GDP of Latin America, right? Like it's just never going to happen. So they are again making that same risk reward calculation. We're never going to get into the US anyways, so why not? Why not come to Montana, right? Even if the FDA gets mad at us, what do we really have to lose, right? And then, there are also treatments where we've seen some companies who will get through the FDA approval process, but they're privately funded. And this is a culture thing where the founder maybe like still owns a majority of shares or the investor board is a lot of Silicon Valley guys who are willing to be a little more aggressive, and they think their treatment is so promising or they have such high profile backers that they're basically willing to like take on the FDA in a direct fight, and they really want to help patients. So that's the typical profile of who we see that's actually willing to come. But unfortunately, a lot of cases where we're dealing with more like immediate, urgent, life-threatening illnesses don't fall into these buckets. cancer companies are able to raise money. So a lot of our cancer treatments are not really going to be coming to Montana absent an official codification of enforcement discretion. Brody DeVolt, who has a rare disease where the creatine in his blood simply doesn't make its way into his brain. His company, I've talked to the manufacturer personally. They will come if they are given enforcement discretion, but absent that, they still think they've got a good chance at approval, so they're just not going to do it. They can't risk their company getting shut down, right? It's an unfortunate position for us to be in, and this is why, again, I want to be clear, all of these state laws are good, but it's been years, and it's time for the stakeholders from these various states to step up and engage the FDA, because we're not going to be able to get people all the life-saving treatment that they deserve without actively getting the FDA on board in some sense.
Yes, thank you for that answer. And that is a very helpful breakdown of the motives and mindsets of the entities that would be fine with just unwritten non-enforcement versus those that want explicit assurances. And I agree, getting explicit assurances would assuage a lot of the decision makers, particularly in the larger biotech companies that have more formal cultures, probably more distributed decision making, where each stakeholder wants an assurance that they will not suffer really adverse consequences from offering these treatments. Now, you did mention that you had some additional examples of cancer patients who were not quite considered to be terminal, but still were at extraordinarily high risk. And I think it would help our audience to understand more about those cases and the kinds of cases that can exist.
Yeah, so this is the scan of the prostate cancer patient that I was talking to you about. I think this is one good example. Again, you've had your successful surgery, so you're no longer technically terminal, right? But you are at a high risk for recurrence. You are basically barred from using the vast majority of laws. Personalized treatment laws would allow you to. Montana, New Hampshire both allow you to. But again, then there's the federal question. In this particular case, the provider is not willing to come without a guarantee of enforcement discretion. He is going to be at our meeting, the provider, the actual sponsor of this drug, with the FDA on the 16th. So we're hoping we're going to get something there. We'll see. Non-answers are the baseline, but we're trying to push. Another case, I don't have the link sent yet, but if you go to my Twitter profile, you'll see a glioblastoma case. You'll notice it in the picture I used is not the actual scan. It's just from Getty Images. It just shows what glio looks like. But we have a glioblastoma patient who actually tried before he came to us to use expanded access for his condition. Now, glioblastoma is a very lethal cancer. The survival rates are not good. It's not quite pancreatic, but it's pretty bad. He had a surgery to remove some of his tumors in his brain, and then was seeking access to effectively like an iron supplement, which had shown in some studies the likelihood of reducing regrowth. He was told by the FDA, after spending $11,000 of his own money on expanded access, that he could not access this treatment until his tumors had begun to grow back more. So again, once again, we see like the interpretation of what qualifies as terminally or seriously ill requires that you are already on the downslope. So even in cases where like preventative treatments are clearly warranted, right? I mean, like you're talking, this is not something where it's like, I think this might help lower my blood pressure, which could be a problem in the future. This is like, we know the statistical odds that your cancer is going to come back. It is, extremely likely, or it is at least likely enough that like taking some sort of risk under any reasonable risk benefit analysis is warranted. And yet still, the stance when you're trying to assess whether this is like terminal or serious is we're not going to give it to you until the problem has already started again. Now, not only does this, box patients out of care, it also boxes them into a position where by the time they are able to qualify for that care, the care will be less effective. These preventative treatments are more effective when they are administered before regrowth or recurrence of tumors. and yet categorically, a lot of patients are prevented from accessing them in exactly that scenario. This is one of the biggest gaping flaws in the federal system. It's one of the biggest gaping flaws in, you know, the kind of like terminal illness only state level systems. And this is why, you know, to go back to the various different things with Montana, you know, I mentioned we don't have that terminal illness requirement. This is the first point here. This is one of the reasons that that's so important. If you try to box, you know, your program into, you can only treat patients who meet this standard, there will always be edge cases that you didn't anticipate, and there will always be patients who go without care. It's best to instead say, we're going to put qualifications on what treatments can come to the state, not what patients can access the program.
Yes, thank you for that explanation. And Daniel Tweed observes in our chat that these kinds of policies seem to often bear a resemblance to policing types of policies where you're effectively the bait to catch a criminal and preventing the initial crime seems secondary. So if you have to have the tumor or if you have to have the life-threatening condition right now to qualify for the treatment, then that actually misses the vast majority of the opportunities to save the patient's life, because it's easier to prevent than to cure. I think most people understand that, and it's easier to avert something that you know is going to develop before it develops than to fight it after it develops. So it's definitely worthwhile to achieve reforms or access opportunities to patients that don't require that imminent threat to exist. Now, Luis Arroyo in our chat wonders essentially, how does right to try differ from compassionate use? I think this is going to be helpful to a lot of our viewers, in particular in understanding where compassionate use falls short, because the FDA has had compassionate use programs for some time.
Yeah. So from my understanding, compassionate use has kind of since been morphed and moved under the umbrella of expanded access. So when I talk about expanded access, that is the program which now contains within it compassionate use requests. On a federal level, here's the differences. One, as I mentioned earlier, when you use right to try, you are not asking the FDA to approve a program. You are just notifying them. You're saying, hey, we're going to treat this patient. Like we have to keep you abreast of everything. We're going to report all results to you. But under the federal right to try law, the FDA does not have the authority to deny you the permission to do that, right? Expanded access is a little bit different. Expanded access, you have to go to them and say, okay, here is the indication that we're treating for. Here is the patient population that we're selecting for. Here is what the treatment protocol looks like. Please approve our submission. Now, expanded access is what that glioblastoma patient that I told you about was trying to use. And it's exactly why, you know, this is the whole thing of like, you're starting to box out patients because they don't quite meet your definition. You know, you're starting to box out patients because maybe their indication is like slightly different, right? It's a more of a bureaucratic process. Now, I do want to be clear, the patient that I was talking about who got denied, that's definitely an edge case. All right, FDA does approve 99% of requests, but you do see these people fall through the cracks. Like it does happen, and it costs them money, it costs them time, and it costs them their lives. So right to try is generally a more like patient-friendly system. For whatever reason, you know, it just doesn't really see the adoption on the federal level that you need. But that's kind of the difference between those two programs.
Yes, thank you for that clarification. And by the way, we have someone in our chat who is working on some innovative treatments. Alex Moffat writes that his company, Series Cell Inc., is organizing several IRB-approved phase 1 and 2 clinical trials featuring novel totipotent stem cells. They have a patient registry and will use a patient sponsorship model. Daniel Tweed writes, sounds very promising. I wish you success. And John H. writes, interesting. Please keep us apprised. And I would echo that. I would be interested to follow developments with Series Cell Inc., but it looks like this is the kind of provider that would benefit from an expanded right to try environment, because right now they're in phase 1 and 2 clinical trials, and if the treatments show promise, getting them out to patients should be possible within a Montana style framework. Now, Alex, we would be interested in your insights in the chat as to how you feel about the current regime of patient access and whether you would be willing to take the chance with FDA unwritten enforcement discretion, or whether you would prefer written enforcement discretion just to get a real world example of how someone in that space would think about these matters. But I wanted to bring this up because I think a lot of people, including providers, are paying attention to this movement right now, and hopefully if a few of the incentives change, more of them will be willing to make these treatments available to patients. So Stephen, I know you have other content in your appendices, and I want to give you the chance to go through it.
Sure, yeah. Before I do, just one thing, he mentioned the patient sponsorship model. Just before I move on to other stuff, this is one of the more feasible ways to get pre-approval access in the United States. It is also one of the more expensive ways. So if you are rich, you can actually do your own clinical trial. There's a man by the name of Sid Sibrangi. He is the founder of GitLab. He's kind of gone famous recently because he was a billionaire and he effectively hired a bunch of doctors and lawyers and everything to get him the absolute best medicine in the world in the United States. And he did so by organizing special N of 1, which means patient size of 1, clinical trials for himself for the different treatments that he wanted to do. And he's been working with us, kind of pounding the table on how ridiculous this is, because that costs him about $150,000 per clinical trial before even the cost of the drug. So it is inherently out of reach to everyone who is not like enormously wealthy. Now, what sponsors can do is they can actually earn a profit, or they can have patients pay to be a part of a clinical trial. And I do think you're starting to see that be a more popular model. And I hope that I hope it takes off. I hope it continues to be like a very popular thing, but you will always have that inherent cost of the clinical trial, IRB approval, needing to put together your investigators brochures, needing to have someone there to oversee all results, which doesn't actually help in a medical treatment setting. You'll always have that passed on to the patient, right? And so these costs will always be a little bit higher. It's sometimes offset if you're going to use the data from the clinical trial. But while I do think that that is a step in the right direction, it is limited in its upside as a patient access pathway. With that being said, yeah, I'll move on to some of the other stuff that I have to show. I don't know how I open this. I did upload a file called SB535 one-pager. There we go.
Here it is.
Great. So this is a little out of date now, but this just does show kind of a broad breakdown of what SB535 looks like. And what I would point to is these two pie charts on the bottom. So actually, we've had a few additional treatments added since I made this about a month ago, and some of the timelines are a little bit out. But what you can see is that the vast majority of treatments, the vast majority of companies who are interested in coming to Montana are oncology and neurodegenerative companies. There is some healthy aging stuff in there. That's kind of like a broad indication. A lot of that is neurodegenerative. But these are relatively like serious illnesses. These are also, by the way, not the healthy aging guys, but the neurodegenerative and oncology guys. These are also largely the companies that will not come without official enforcement discretion. But what you can see is we are talking about a pretty substantial portfolio of cutting edge cancer treatments that could be available in Montana in a matter of weeks for every American. But once again, it's going to be locked behind that FDA enforcement discretion. Beyond that, we do see some interest from the healthy aging guys or from like longevity guys. So these are companies that are, they might do their clinical trial with one given indication for like, thalamus dysregulation or something like that. But in reality, that's just because they're kind of required to list that indication in their clinical trials. The actual use they're interested in is general longevity, general health span, just general improved health. And Montana does provide an avenue for that, for moving away from the official indication that you had to actually do the clinical trial for. It is, of course, a higher bar to meet evidentiarily when you apply to our review board, but it is possible. And lastly, we do have some sort of, various other treatments. We have some chronic pain stuff. We have one interesting company that does something to supplement results for organ transplantation, which is like pretty interesting. But yeah, I think this is like a good breakdown of what the actual treatment portfolio of Montana SB 535 could be, even just 30 or 45 days from now, if we manage to get something through at the FDA.
Yes, and Daniel Tweed actually wonders because the header says status rules and public comment period, final vote expected June 8th, 2026. So that's tomorrow. And that's not on the bill itself. That's on the rules to implement the bill at the State Department of Health and Human Services, as I understand it.
So
Correct?
I did mention some of these timelines are a little out. This particular thing is like a little bit over a month old. The rules vote coming through have been kind of delayed for about a month. Let me explain the legislative process a little bit here. The law has been passed. That was last year. I think it was like August or May or something. That law instructed the Montana Department of Health to come up with licensing rules for ETRBs, ETCs, etc. They finished that process in April. Took them quite a long time. And then there was a 30 to 60 day public commentary period. June 8th was the earliest they could have theoretically published this. We have since heard from them they are targeting July 8th. We are pushing them to move faster as we do have some life-threatening cases. But right now that date is a little bit uncertain. But once they publish those rules, unless the Montana legislature actively goes back and shuts them down, which we're in contact with the various legislators is extraordinarily unlikely, then that is the kind of go live date for the program. That is the date where we can theoretically begin opening up review boards, clinics, and actually treating patients.
Yes, thank you for that clarification. And indeed, I share your hope that the vote on the rules will happen sooner rather than later. So probably not tomorrow, but perhaps sometime in June.
To be clear, so this is just like a little legislative nuance. That vote already happened. Now it is about publishing post vote, and then there could be another vote, but there probably won't be.
I see.
This is, we're talking about sort of legislative procedural nuances. Generally speaking, we're feeling very good about everything just passing through as is. It's just a matter of timing.
Yes. And Daniel Tweed also wonders about the acronym ETCs. These are experimental treatment centers, correct?
Clinics, but yeah. There might be centers. I could be wrong, but it's same idea. These are the physical locations at which treatment will be administered, and doctors will see people.
Now, one discussion that we had, and I know Stephen, you participated in this in our working group in Nevada on bringing expanded right to try to Nevada, is that in Montana, these experimental treatment centers are required to be standalone, whereas in Nevada right now, there is some option under Nevada law for hospitals to offer those treatments as well. So could you perhaps shed some light as to why the decision was made to structure SB 535 to essentially require the ETCs to be apart from existing medical facilities?
Yeah, so this is something where we, as in like Infinita, did not get what we wanted. That's just the nature of politics. You don't get everything you want. We wanted them to be able to co-locate with facilities, or at least use the surgical facilities in existing hospitals if that was needed and there was no available ETC, right? But from what I understand, and you have to understand my insight into this is limited because as a stakeholder, the department can only respond to me through the formal rulemaking process. But what I was told through that process is that there were people who are involved with making sure that Montana continues to get all of its like rural health care funding and Medicare and Medicaid funding from HHS and FDA, who were worried that co-locating these facilities within existing hospitals would potentially jeopardize or threaten some of that funding. Now, this is another area where uncertainty and lack of communication from the federal departments is actively inhibiting the ability of us to treat patients. I don't think in all likelihood that is going to happen. But we actually saw something similar in New Hampshire where they just passed HB 1735, but only if the New Hampshire kind of budget office puts out a report that shows there is no threatening its HHS or federal funding, right? So this is a trend that you tend to see a lot, is that the uncertainty from state level actors as to how this could potentially threaten their funding is leading them to be, in my opinion, overly cautious. And that is leading to a blocker for patients. It is leading to increased costs to set up these facilities. But the TLDR is that if you want to come to a state like Montana and you want to build an experimental treatment clinic, it's going to have to be physically separated from any existing clinic which takes like Medicare, Medicaid funding, or anything like that, which in the modern era of American healthcare is just every big hospital, basically.
Yes, so it's uncertainty about whether that funding might be jeopardized if the funders, Medicare, Medicaid, figure out that these experimental treatments are being offered and they wonder, do they really want to spend taxpayer money on them? And then the state level actors wonder, do we really want to take that risk in prompting those kinds of questions? Yes, it seems like uncertainty can be the largest roadblock to making available treatments that otherwise are very appealing from the standpoint of at least giving patients a chance.
Yep. And you have to understand that uncertainty is kind of there's this idea that like an object at rest stays at rest, right? Unless it is acted upon by an external force. The same is very true in legislation and regulation. The easiest thing for the FDA and HHS to do is nothing, right? The easiest thing to do is to say, we're not going to draft any official policies. We're also not going to enforce. We're just going to kind of let everything continue on the current status quo as it is. But that uncertainty now, it is undeniable. We can point to these specific cases. We have written documentation from the specific providers. We can show the entire supply chain to treat certain patients, at least one of whom is a 3-year-old child, is ready and willing to go under some of these state laws. And the sole factor is the remaining uncertainty around how federal enforcement discretion will be exercised, right? And similarly, again, you can see it here. Is Robert F. Kennedy the man who talked on a podcast about how ridiculous it was he had to fly to Antigua to get stem cell treatments? Is he really going to jeopardize the HHS funding that goes to Montana or New Hampshire because they're trying to get people experimental treatments? No. Is that in writing? Also no. So when these various legislators and policymakers or even investors at a company have to analyze risk reward, it doesn't really matter how strong the evidentiary case is that they're not going to do it. The question becomes like, well, will they put that in writing? If so, how can we be sure? It's the same reason that you can't do big business deals on like a handshake, right? It's just a matter of, if you want this stuff to be made official, if you want the stances, which the current administration and the FDA for many years and HHS for many years all have clearly been in practice already observing, but if you want them to be useful enough that you can actually do business, that you can actually get treatment to patients, you've got to get something in writing. And that is a lot harder than it sounds.
Yes. Thank you for that explanation. By the way, we have a follow-up comment from Alex Moffat. It seems like he would be willing to proceed with an understanding of unwritten assurances of non-enforcement, but he says he'll share details and we can discuss more maybe if Alex is open to it, we could even have a follow-up virtual Enlightenment Salon on this, because I think this is the area where the most near-term progress can be made in terms of actually enabling patients to benefit. And along these lines, in terms of access to the FDA, so you've been able to set up a meeting for the 16th of this month, you stated, and I'm curious, how easy was it to do that? And how likely do you think that the FDA officials will at least hear you out and consider your points and not dismiss them? It seems that there's a kind of duality there. On the one hand, FDA officials are not bad people, and it seems to me they are interested in saving lives, in the sense that, as you pointed out, when there is a right to try application, they do fast track it. On the other hand, as federal officials or employees, they're often faced with incentives where they have to think about the risk to themselves, the risk to their careers of doing something or not doing something, or articulating something explicitly. And I'm curious as to your assessment of how they would perceive the risk to themselves of explicitly saying, we will not enforce this particular law or this particular prohibition.
Yeah, so there's multiple competing influences within FDA and HHS right now, right? There's, on the one hand, it is no secret that RFK and President Trump are very pro right to try. They're very pro regenerative medicine. They're very pro stem cell. And look, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how big the big pharma guy who is cutting checks or promising you a job when you retire from the FDA is. The president and the secretary of HHS are your bosses, right? They are the ones who decide if you continue working, and they could easily destroy your career now and forever, right? So that is one competing force. The challenge is getting them to be aware of issues, right? The other competing force is sort of the careerist faction at the FDA. These are people who have been at the FDA for a long time. They are not in favor of right to try. The FDA was an enormous opponent of right to try. They, as cold and cruel as it sounds, as kind of like cartoonishly evil as it sounds, they would let terminally ill patients go without medicine before they would renounce the authority or reduce the authority of the organization which bestows them with proxy authority and status through their membership in that organization. All right. So that is a competing force. And then there is a third competing force of various interest groups. There's patient advocates, there's big pharma, there's manufacturers, there's contract research organizations, which tends to be more split. You know, on this particular issue, it does not cut down as evenly as you'd think. You know, a lot of people think big pharma is going to be against this. We've seen they're mostly kind of ambivalent about this. This is just small potatoes to them, you know. But for us, and the way that we kind of view these upcoming meetings with the FDA, our concern is not them saying like, no, we will not grant any sort of enforcement discretion. We're really not worried about that. Our concern is a non-answer. Our concern is we are going to refuse to clarify our stance here. We reserve all rights to enforce, but we're not going to tell you when we would and when we wouldn't. We don't acknowledge that we are practicing enforcement discretion. That is the bad outcome. And so our job is to kind of put them in a position where it has to be obvious that, one, if they don't provide an answer, they are actively blocking certain patients from getting treatment. And two, if they don't provide an answer, they are going against the will of the president and the secretary, right? Now, we have been told off the record by some of the senior folks at FDA we've talked to that the perception within HHS and FDA is that if the president were to find out that they said no to our request, it would be bad for whoever like gave that no, right? And similarly, we spent a lot of time briefing various senators' offices. You know, there's a lot of states who have these programs now, right? So that's a lot of senators whose votes are needed to confirm FDA nominees in the upcoming nomination process. We spend a lot of time making sure that they are all well aware of this issue, right? So our goal is to get them in there and to basically make this something where they can't say no, but getting them to give anything other than a non-answer is a harder hill to climb.
Yes, I can see the challenge there. Now I'm curious, what do you think about the current, let's say, state of leadership transition at the FDA and
Yeah.
how it might influence outcomes one way or the other? For those who don't know, recently the FDA commissioner, Marty Makary, who was previously in that position since the start of the Trump administration, resigned over reasons that were unrelated to right to try or patient access. And now there's an acting FDA commissioner, but it's not yet clear what the, let's say, stable leadership of the FDA is going to look like. So do you think that introduces additional complications, or that's an opportunity perhaps?
Double-edged sword. Double-edged sword is the answer. Like, look, on the one hand, it is a big leverage point for us to be able to get senators who will say, like, yeah, I will ask upcoming nominees, like, what's their stance on this, and I will not accept a non-answer, right? That's like, we've got, I can't say who, but we've got one or two senators who have committed to that. And I do believe we're at the point now where, like, we could effectively probably block some nominations for FDA commissioner if someone tried to just give that whole, like, well, I can't comment on enforcement policy answer, right? However, that's, no one know, that could be any time in the next 270 days, right? So that's not going to help the patients who need treatment in the next few months, right? So the question becomes, well, what happens while Kyle Diamandis is in charge? And no one's really sure. We know that the mandate he has been given by the administration is kind of like keep things steady. We know that there's a lot of attention on trying to fix the system for rare disease patients, right, which is good for us. We know that, you know, we know some things, but he has not been going out and making a lot of comments. There's mixed reports on whether he is even really interested in a full-time position. You know, on the one hand, I've seen reports that he's like shoring up support in the Senate. On the other hand, I just saw an article by Endpoints which says that he has stated he's not interested in a full-time position. And it's also not clear, if he's not interested, who would be likely to replace him, right? And then additionally, there's this factor of, for an acting FDA commissioner to go out on a limb and actually do a kind of like pretty big policy like this would be a big move, which means that we have to aim for the policy coming from HHS, not from FDA. So that limits our options, right? So there's various trade-offs, and we're keeping in mind, you know, all of the different ways we could play this, and we're playing it to the best of our ability. But it's really hard to get a good sense of what is actually going on and what the administration is thinking. We continue to believe that the key to all of this is just making Secretary Kennedy or the president himself aware of the issue. And we certainly hope that, you know, Kyle Diamandis is not going to be adamantly against this. You know, he's got a food background, not a drug background, which makes it very hard to predict how he's going to view these issues. But, you know, we remain optimistic, and, you know, we remain committed to doing everything we can to try to push this forward as fast as possible so that some of our time-sensitive patients can actually get treatment.
Yes, thank you for that answer. And what is interesting is I've pulled up the Wikipedia page for Kyle Diamandis, the acting FDA commissioner. He's actually several months younger than I am. So he has reached that level of authority, even though it's an acting position. Still, he has authority over the FDA right now. And perhaps, at least if I can provide some insight as to what people in that stage of their careers might be thinking, especially if they've reached that higher level, perhaps he could be persuaded from the angle of, this is your chance to make a difference, whether you stay as the FDA commissioner or you move on to something else. This is your opportunity to act quickly, while you're still new and do something that provides a major benefit to patients that, one, you can always be proud of as a decision that you've helped to realize, and two, wherever you go later on in your career, this will be essentially a feather in your cap, an achievement that you can speak of to others as to how you are a capable, innovative decision maker. So just some thoughts on that. I don't know if you'll be able to meet with him directly, but I would say if I ever found myself in the position of acting FDA commissioner, this is something that would be a no-brainer to me. But of course, that's based on my worldview and the priorities that I have, where saving lives is, of course, at the top of the list.
Yeah, and we certainly, I think it would probably be better for us if he was interested in keeping the position full time, frankly, for a lot of the reasons that you're talking about, which is at that point it becomes necessary for him to have a few victories that he can point to, and from our perspective, being able to show a Marine father of two who was successfully able to get life-saving treatment for his 3-year-old child seems like a fairly easy victory, but it's always more complicated than that. The people who rise to the tops of these positions, they are constantly needing to balance pressure and interest from various stakeholders, some of whom are against us. And so, we're going to do everything we can. I really doubt he'll be at this first meeting of ours, right? Like, just, if he is, that would be a really strong sign that we could be optimistic. But seems relatively unlikely.
Understood. So I think it's also worthwhile to consider the dimension of public support. And Daniel Tweed wonders, doesn't right to try approval rank fairly high in public polls? And do we have any numbers on this? Intuitively, it seems to me, if one were to hold a plebiscite right now, should there be right to try of the most expanded kind, the majority, at least, of American voters would say yes. But what do you know in terms of actual opinion polls, if any, on the subject?
So the Alliance for Longevity Initiative is the only polling that I've seen on a national level, and they had something like 72% in favor, 10% unsure, 18% against, which is really good numbers. That 10% unsure especially is doing a lot of work. My suspicion is that this is also the kind of issue where, as you inform people more about the issue, they are more likely to become your supporter, right? There are certain issues where you want people finding out more or less information, because it's more likely to bring them to your side. We do have the advantage here of, as the average person, gets more educated, they are more likely to be, in our camp. That said, there's probably a lot of polling on the state level as well. That's a little murkier because each state law is a little different, right? And I've seen personally very weird things where, like, essentially a copy paste of the same state law can swing wildly based on who introduces it. In Montana, when we were moving through the local legislature, we got some really strong early opposition from like anti-vaccine groups, which made our movement here a little more like blue coded. In New Hampshire, when we were pushing through 1734, we had early support from a religious liberty group out there, and so our coalition was like largely Republican, right? So this is also it's interesting to watch how the exact same text, based on not what it says but where it originated from, can provoke wildly different reactions. And this is something I've seen trying to engage, Democrats at the federal level too. There are a lot of people who, on balance, support right to try ideologically, but don't want to sign up for supporting something that originated from Donald Trump. And it's really unfortunate, because when you're dealing with cancer patients, trying to get life-saving treatment, it would be nice for this not to be like so explicitly red coded. But there's all sorts of little nuances to the popularity based on that. We prioritize trying to get one explicitly blue state to pass a strong right to try law like Montana's, precisely so that we can start making this a more bipartisan issue, because I don't think right to try has to be Republican. in any sense. But right now, that is, if I'm being frank, like a kind of weight around the movement. It's not too bad because we have a very Republican-controlled Capitol right now. The president, the House, and the Senate are all Republican. But it is a potential long-term risk if we don't start to get more like blue-coded support for these kind of movements.
Yes, and indeed, I agree with you that right to try should not be a partisan right-wing or left-wing issue. So here in the US Transhumanist Party, we're up-wing, so we seek to transcend those distinctions altogether. And you also observed that the anti-vaccination groups were the ones that opposed right to try in Montana, but there are left-wing sources of opposition too in places like New Hampshire. So New Hampshire has had some challenges getting its expanded right to try legislation passed. And I wonder, for the benefit of our audience, if you could comment on what the obstacles there were, and were they more ideologically left-wing or were they more parochial? Like, I know there was a pharmacist legislator, David Rochefort, who essentially formed the crux of the opposition. I don't think he's a left-wing ideologue, but it does seem like he had some very particular interests that he felt were endangered by this legislation.
Well, this is maybe like a commentary on the New Hampshire legislature generally, but the House in New Hampshire is very liberal or libertarian minded, right? It's very pro-liberty generally. The Senate is not so much. The Senate is maybe more kind of, I don't want to say neocon necessarily, but more mainstream Republican, more rhino-ish, right? And what you've seen a lot, and this was not just with us, but there was also a campus carry bill where the same thing happened. The House would pass something, and then it would go to the Senate. And in order for the Senate to move a bill forward, it has to first go through something called a committee of conference. A number of people on that committee of conference would negotiate with the House for various compromises. And then even if they were given effectively every single thing that they wanted, at the very last minute, they would just categorically refuse to move the bill forward. This deprived the House of the time to organize a real resistance against this. Now, in the case of right to try, we had two bills, 1734 and 1735. Our coalition was very strong and was very angry at the way that Senator Rochefort in particular handled these negotiations. And his motivations, to be clear, were entirely business related. He owns a bunch of compound pharmacies. He was worried this would take business from him. It's just that simple. So they were very angry, and they effectively tied our bills together with a number of the other Senate priorities and said, like, okay, you don't want to move these bills forward, like, you don't get to move any of your stuff forward either. That came down to a like kind of last minute agreement. One of our bills moved forward with some modifications. There was an attempted poison pill in there by the Senate. I don't think it will work. The other bill did not go forward, but we got some of what we wanted, but we didn't get all of what we wanted, which is, again, that's just politics, right? But I do think this is a good example. We did not really have strong, like, organized Democratic resistance. We actually, I think, brought 13 Democrat voters over in the House when we were passing the bill. And so the resistance that we did have, I think, was largely just sort of like standard party politics, where it's like, well, the Republicans are pushing this forward, so the Democrats have to oppose it, right? Which is, this is a big factor in politics, but that's also not like a very strong resistance. That's not the kind of thing that you will spend a ton of political capital on. In New Hampshire particularly, we ran into more of an issue where it's just like there was one key guy who looked at this bill and just said, like, this is going to threaten my livelihood personally. You know, if you can go get prescriptions at one of these experimental treatment centers, you don't need to come to my compound pharmacy anymore. Could ETCs even set up their own competing compound pharmacies without having to go through all the same licensure that I do? I'm not going to vote this through. And not only that, I'm not even going to tell you that's not why I'm voting this through, right? So I'm going to have this motivation and not be straight with you about it. And it's only really going to be something you can infer based on my behavior, which is really a recurring theme in politics, I have found. But look, these are the kind of things that you take your lumps, you learn. If we come to Nevada, I will encourage everybody to try to proactively loop in compound pharmacy stakeholders, because our job is to get these bills passed. It's not to take a righteous stand. Oh, we shouldn't have to grease the palms of the compound pharmacy guys. Like, no, if they need to be ensured that this will not threaten their livelihood in order for a bill to pass and in order for cancer patients to get treatment, then they should be insured. They should be looped in early, and we should avoid repeating the mistakes of the past. But I think this is a good example of how sometimes you find somebody who has an economic or personal interest against this, and they can't or won't even be straight with you about what their reasoning is. And so you just don't know until it's too late why they're against you, or even that they are against you. It's a very difficult part of the political process.
Yes. And of course, to somebody who is very rationally inclined and very much appreciates explicit communication, I'm certainly in that camp. That is extremely frustrating, but that's the situation with the FDA right now as well, not saying explicitly that they won't enforce the law and not being willing to give a full commitment. And it's not always clear what their reasons for not giving that commitment are. So many parallels there, as you've observed. And our friend Mike Lazine, welcome, Mike, by the way, says he was just talking to his brother about this, let's say, reflexively oppositional quality of contemporary politics, the whole issue of how Democrats don't want to work with Republicans just because they're Republicans and vice versa. And Mike says that is stupid politics because, yes, it's completely blind to the actual substance of the policy. It's just, we're against whatever the other side is for. We're for whatever the other side is against. And I've observed, especially over the past 10 years, just extremely common flip-flopping where the Democrats might start out with an idea, and then if the Republicans pursue it, the Democrats all of a sudden are opposed to the idea and expect their members of various legislatures to fall in line. And even the hardline Democratic partisans on social media will start lambasting this idea that they were ardently in support of several years ago. So,
Yep.
And the same could be said for hardline Republican partisans as well. It's a frustrating tendency. But as you pointed out, because it's so ephemeral, because people switch their views on these issues so often, it might actually be possible to get something passed unless you have real hardline ideologues standing in the way. So best wishes in New Hampshire, and hopefully incrementally getting more through of that expanded right to try package. Now, I also wanted to give you the chance to present another exhibit that you prepared on drug costs. So
Sure.
we'll pull that up here.
So, yeah, this kind of goes through. I mean, so we could imagine two worlds, right? We can imagine the continuation of the current status quo, and we can imagine a world where there do exist all of these like post phase one markets, even though they're cash only, right? And this is very similar to that like Venn diagram or concentric circle diagram that I showed you earlier. But I think this is a good way to visualize for people the constraints of drug development, right? You start off with a very simple number, which is how much money is it going to take you to get to the point where you can start earning cash flow? Now, a lot of people don't know this, but if you have a treatment which is going through the clinical pipeline, you are federally prohibited from charging or commercializing for that treatment. There's carve-outs. You can do a clinical trial and you can charge people to participate in the clinical trial. You can do an IP licensing deal. You might be able to do something overseas, although the FDA tends to frown upon that. But there are carve-outs, but generally you are prohibited, right? So you will have to raise, not just earn from cash flows, but you will have to go raise from the private markets approximately $1 billion. And in fact, this is actually underestimating it. The average cost is something closer to $2 billion, but let's be conservative, right? Now, it's going to take you from the day that you discover a molecule in a lab to going all the way to the end of your phase 3 clinical trial and then getting approved by the FDA. It's going to take you somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 years, right? Which means if you start with a 20-year patent life, by the time you're done, you're going to have 8 years left. Now, as I mentioned earlier, when you have patent coverage, that's when you get to determine the price the drug sells for. This is when your returns count, right? So you will have 8 years of patent life remaining, but you can extend that patent life by 5 years after your drug is approved. So let's bump that up to 13, right? Now, this 18,000 patients per year figure, I took a pretty successful drug, not quite like a GLP-1, but it's called Humira. And I just broke down how many patients on average has it treated per year post-approval during its remaining patent life. And that's how I got that number of about 18,600 people per year. So we know that in your remaining patent life of 13 years, you're going to treat approximately 250,000 patients, right? And we can take all of these numbers, the money that had to be invested in you, a minimum required return on investment over your remaining patent life after extension, and then we can divide that by how many patients you're going to treat, and we can actually get a number of how much you're going to need to charge to hit the minimum ROI for your drug to be investable, and it comes down to somewhere in the neighborhood of about $4,000 per patient, right? I can't see what that number on the bottom is. Yes. It looks like you're gonna. Oh, sorry, I misquoted that. The development costs when you bake in all of your costs are about $4,000. You're going to need to add on top of that about $815 in order to make your ROI, right? Return on investment. So that brings us to a number where you can say, and this is wildly rough. This is wildly back of napkin. But you need to be able to show that you're going to be able to charge about $4,800 per patient for your drug to be investable under the current system, right? Now, if we take that exact same number of patients being treated per year and we model out how much it would need to make under a system where companies could go to market post phase 1, I won't go through the whole calculation again, but you get more patent life, you have to raise less money, right? The actual number that you would need to make is $24 per patient, right? That is the same ROI percentage, right? So this is just to show, there's all this talk about the cost of healthcare and the cost of drugs in the United States. A lot of focus gets put on like insurance and reimbursement rates and all of that. This is an element of that problem which does not get a lot of attention, but the effects are quite drastic. If you were to imagine a world where, Q-stars were enabled and you did see treatments going to market with like safety data proving efficacy later, drug costs and drug development costs are going to drop so precipitously that when I show people the numbers, it's hard to believe. You can run through this equation yourself. It's very easy to do. The math does hold up, but it is something like 200 times lower in terms of the cost to actually get a drug to market and have it be a profitable investment. And this is an element of things that we don't tend to stress too much in our pitches, just because we found through trial and error what is most effective is talking about patient access. But if you're somebody who is interested in really seeing drug development or drug, like automated drug discovery, for example, which is coming out of a lot of data centers now, if you're interested in seeing that flourish, dropping the minimum amount that you need to make from like nearly $5,000 to basically $25 opens up a lot of potential. There's a whole spectrum of treatments that become investable under that second model that will never see the light of day, despite being able to help a lot of patients under the existing status quo.
Yes, and absolutely the cost considerations, the investability considerations are crucial for the decision makers themselves to determine whether they'll make the drugs or other treatments available. Now, Art Ramon has an interesting comment. He writes, I guess when drugs become cheap to create, like with 3D printing, then the workarounds would be more useful if the government does not want to release the stranglehold. So, Art Ramon, do you mean that for those entities that are then able to cheaply 3D print the drugs, it would be more lucrative to go to an expanded right to try state like Montana, perhaps rely on unwritten federal enforcement discretion and make them available, as contrasted with the companies that have to go through the pathway on the left-hand side here and would incur significant costs and significant risk.
Yeah, I was more suggesting when it's possible for people to just sort of create their own drugs, when you could get the raw ingredients and just, manufacture your own drugs. That's sort of what I was thinking along the lines when I wrote that statement. But if the government had some opposition to that, well, that's where those gray areas come in. But yeah, that would be like I said, making your own drugs. Which things like DMT, like the government gives DMT, any sort of DMT testing, and I don't think DMT is that hard to make. So.
Yeah, the iron supplement that I was mentioning for our glioblastoma patient is actually a good example of this. I mean, it's I have met patients who are facing life-threatening illnesses who are either manufacturing their own drug because they can't get it, and it's not that hard to make, right? Or they are hiring kind of black or gray market manufacturers out of like India or China or Mexico or something like that. Now, it's ridiculous to need to go to those lengths when you've got like terminally ill brain cancer, right? These are not people who don't have the money. They're happy to pay. But the blocker is not that the drug is like expensive or hard to manufacture. The blocker is if a company tries to give it to them, the feds are going to show up at their door and shut the company down. So it's a situation that is absurd enough that I hope someone will one day write like a satirical novel about it. Right. A lot of these people don't have the right to try it. They have the right to die. And that's about it. I hope that we will all live to see, maybe in the next month, the permanent closure of the invisible graveyard, which has resulted from all of this.
Yes, I definitely hope so. And to your point, we have right now a situation where medically assisted dying is legal in Oregon, and even the entire country of Canada has legalized it. And in the Netherlands, it's been legal for a few decades. And yet, people in those jurisdictions do not often have access to experimental treatments that could save their lives. I wonder where the disconnect is, why those legislators that are willing to let people end their own lives if they believe their conditions are so far gone, are not willing to let perhaps those same people take a few chances, even if they do ultimately elect to end their lives. Before they elect to end their lives, couldn't they take a few chances to try to save or extend their lives? It just makes no sense to me.
I don't know if you're familiar with the drug thalidomide,
Yes.
but we all live in the shadow of the thalidomide scandal, and we have for essentially, I think, the last like 50 years, right? Now, listen, it is important that there are safety standards to make sure that something like that never happens again. But I've talked a lot about the incentives of individual bureaucrats, right? Individual people within these regulatory agencies. You and I would make the kind of calculation like, of course, we can't block someone from getting a potentially life-saving treatment if they're definitely going to die, right? That is perhaps why you and I will never be the head of the FDA, because the kind of people who make those calculations, at some point something will go wrong, and it doesn't matter whether a nuanced understanding of the situation leads somebody to conclude that you did the right thing. What matters is the headline, because if that headline comes out about a decision you were overseeing and it's bad, then your career is done, right? And so if you think about it, there's never going to be a negative headline about medically assisted dying. And actually, there's a very interesting case. There was a court case that established in the Supreme Court the FDA's right to exercise enforcement discretion. It was around a lethal injection, where it's called Heckler v. Cheney. It was about the FDA basically refusing to enforce safety and efficacy standards around a pre-approval lethal injection, which is just kind of funny. Like, what is a safety standard for a lethal injection, right? But you know, if you think about something going wrong when someone is literally dying, like there's never going to be a headline about it because something, you know, going wrong in that scenario is them being alive for a little bit longer than they should have been. But if you think about something going wrong when a guy gets medical treatment and then ends up dying of liver failure instead of what was going to kill him anyways, this is something that happened with Duchenne's and a recent treatment called Sarepta. The smart, like the pure game theory calculus, uh, you know, spreadsheet maximizer move to make is to just never expose yourself to that risk as a bureaucrat anyways. Now, the best way to never expose yourself to that risk is to make sure that you don't even have the power on paper to approve that, right? Then no one can ever say you're not giving me that approval. And at the same time, if something goes wrong, you can say like, well, that wasn't my job, right? I didn't do that, right? And that is, again, that is kind of the inertia you need to fight. Once you get them into that position where they do have to actively make a decision to approve or not approve, it tends to be a lot easier because at that point they have to weigh the risk reward of like, do I want the bad headline of patients saying that they can't get access to a drug because of me, or do I want to risk the bad headline of some patient dying because, you know, I approved something that a reasonable risk reward calculus did say I should approve, but it still went wrong. They will tend to still lean towards the approvals. The hard part is getting them into that position where they will accept that authority to begin with, because it's putting themselves in a position where they're taking risk and they just don't want to do that. They would far prefer to just do the risk-free thing and keep slowly climbing up that career ladder and taking that $250,000 a year check and getting to work remote because it's the FDA. It's a pretty cushy gig, but it's just tough.
Yes, and to your point, reconfiguring the incentives is extremely important. John H. points out that the FDA did protect Americans during the thalidomide incident in the 1960s. Most of the victims were in other countries, but thalidomide, at least that version of it, was not approved in the United States.
Yes.
And so the learnings from that experience were that the FDA is right to be preemptive. The FDA is right to be very careful about what it does approve, and it's much more willing to accept the error where it fails to approve a life-saving efficacious treatment than the error where it does approve something that ends up harming patients. Now, in terms of altering the incentives, we have a question from Kevin Bransaforti. Do you have any suggested language that we can use with our federal representatives to push them to expand right to try, like any sort of rhetorical tactics that have worked in getting people on board with this fairly broad coalition that you have assembled?
Yeah, if you want to go back to the slide deck really quick. Yeah, so let me just... So here's what you should do. If you want to call your representative, if you live in one of these states, right? And statistically speaking, it is almost a certainty if you're in the United States that you do. I guess if you're in New York, you know, or Massachusetts, tough luck. But if you live in one of these other states, you should call your representative and you should tell them the FDA is going to be meeting with a group of stakeholders arguing for enforcement discretion for state level programs like ours. It is called the Q-Star policy. I encourage my federal representative to reach out to the FDA and express their support for instituting the Q-Star policy immediately. That is what you should do. Don't worry too much about sharpening the pitch beyond that. What matters is the volume of calls, right? If this is something where you have some sort of internal connection to a given federal representative or one of their high-level staffers, you should reach out to me because playing that is a slightly different ballgame, right? But basically let them know there is something in the works to make it so that the FDA's official stance is not that we reserve the right to come shut down companies treating, you know, patients in your state. We are instead going to actually make it clear how to do so, and that you support making that stance official. Rhetorically, if you want to get into more details of the pitch, the top line here is this is not actually asking anybody to change their behavior. It's asking them to codify their existing behavior. Let's see. That.
Yes. So we are asking the FDA to codify its unwritten enforcement discretion toward state programs. That's, I think, a good rhetorical line to use, and a lot of federal politicians will see parallels to what happened with cannabis over the decades, where cannabis had been a Schedule 1 controlled substance until very recently, when it was downgraded to a Schedule 3 controlled substance. But for a few decades, states were enacting laws allowing first medical marijuana and then recreational cannabis as well. And even though in principle cannabis was prohibited in the most extreme way at the federal level, I'm not aware of any instances where the federal government went after a state that had legalized cannabis in some capacity, as long as the uses were in compliance with that state law. So
Yeah,
perhaps
that was official, by the way. That was an official stance. There were two things. There was the Cole memo and the Rohrabacher FAR. I could be messing that up, but I'm pretty sure these were both cannabis. But there was an official prohibition on the DEA from using any federal funds to enforce or take action against a company that was distributing cannabis according to state law, right? This is pretty similar in spirit to what we are asking for. There are some nuanced differences. You know, we still require reporting to FDA. We still require that if FDA tells you, you know, you plan to do A, B, and C, we want you to do X, Y, and Z. We still require that you obey the FDA in our Q-Star policy, right? If anything, we're giving the FDA far more insight into these state level markets than the DEA ever got into anything going on in cannabis, right? But it is in spirit, it is the same idea, which is there are limited resources available. You have to prioritize where should those be put for enforcement, and it is not a good use of resources for the federal government to go crack down on companies trying to treat cancer patients under a state law.
yes, indeed. Now, a lot of people are asking about New York on the map of Q stars that you showed, because as far as I see it, it's in gray, which means there's no state legislation. What is the status of New York? Does New York offer any sort of expanded access or right to try, either de facto or de jure?
Not that I'm aware of. Listen, it's tough to keep track of 50 different state legislatures. So let me hedge a little bit and say that there is a possibility I got this map wrong in some sense, right? But as far as I know, New York is one of just a few states that does not have any sort of state level right to try whatsoever. Now, there's some nuance here because keep in mind the federal right to try passed in 2018. So a lot of these like dark blue states, which are terminal illness only right to try, that passed before the federal law. And a lot of the legislators at the state level say like, well, what's the point of doing our own state law that's just a clone of the federal law, which by the way, I kind of agree with. That's not really like a sensible thing to do. But as far as I know, New York does not have a stem cell law. It does not have a broadened right to try law. It does not have a right to personalized treatment law. It does not have a, you know, anything really as far as I can tell. And I'll also tell you that like generally we look at these very deep blue states like New York or Massachusetts, and you know I would love to get something there. I really would. I've told you before it would be a huge win for us to have this be a bipartisan thing, but I don't think it's going to happen. So sorry, man. If you're in New York, you should get in your car and drive to New Hampshire.
It's interesting too, because now with the map the way it is, there's just a cluster of states in the New England area, essentially New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, and not even really New Hampshire anymore, because you got some of what you were asking for in New Hampshire, but Vermont and Maine have some access to right to try. So yeah, it's just that cluster kind of around New York in this mid-Atlantic, lower New England area that seems to be most resistant. I am not sure how to explain that. And Delaware too, it seems, which is odd.
I mean, look, again, I want to hedge. Maybe the map is wrong, right? Entirely possible. But yeah, our general perception of things is like these are sort of the power centers of the Democratic Party. And, for whatever reason, there is not interest at the top of the Democratic Party in passing this kind of like patient access pathway stuff. I hope that changes. If someone were to come to me from one of these states, my suggestion would be like maybe try to do something more niche dedicated towards reproductive health, right? But right now it's just not happening.
Yes, I'm sure that there are plenty of women who would be interested in access to, say, innovative IVF treatments. And that may be a good talking point with Democrats, because at least in the course of the flip-flopping that we discussed, when there was a risk after the 2022 Supreme Court decision that some states might try to ban IVF treatments, which would be ridiculous in my view, there were a lot of left-leaning advocates that were saying essentially, hands off my right to get an IVF treatment. And of course, I completely agree. IVF is a wondrous medical advance, and there needs to be expanded access to it. But maybe that could be a line of argument if there are innovative ways of facilitating or delivering IVF treatments that haven't fully passed the FDA review process that could improve women's reproductive choices. So definitely,
I mean, it's
something to think about.
it's something we would like to do. I know we just talked to a company doing like some women's healthcare stuff. I think it is like IVF type stuff the other day, right? It's a way to build that coalition. The funny thing is those same people who would say hands off the state IVF stuff will also pound the table and say they don't like our Q-Star policy generally, even though the Q-Star policy is what makes the state IVF stuff viable.
Right.
Again, it's just team sports, man. It's just a team sport.
Yes.
I gotta jump soon. So could we maybe do like one or two more things and then kind of wrap this up?
Yes. So we'll do one more question, and then I'll let you offer some concluding remarks. So Kevin Bransaforti wonders, in terms of drugs that work in saving a person's life, but then they can't qualify for approval under current right to try or expanded access because they don't have the tumor anymore, they don't have the life-threatening condition. He wonders, is there any way to have the preventative be added on to the original treatment? Like have a clause saying, well, if you're approved to get this investigational treatment, then whatever else is needed kind of in that protocol to prevent you from ever having that disease again, if it works, would be part of that approval.
Somewhat. So if I were going to try to organize something like that for a patient under the federal systems, I would definitely be leaning more towards right to try than expanded access. Here's why. Expanded access, as I mentioned, you have to outline the specific treatment protocol to the FDA and seek their approval. Now, what they're going to ask is, does the indication that you're treating for, and to be clear, the indication is something like, it's not as simple as this treats cancer. It's like this treats this particular kind of cancer that presents this kind of way, right? So you're going to have to be very narrow in that. And if you try to take an expanded access application to the FDA and say, well, this wasn't in clinical trials tested for this exact scenario, but we think it would be good here, that is probably where they will deny it. There's some drugs out in California right now. I know this Anktiva stuff is being approved for expanded access for bladder cancer. A lot of evidence shows that it would be very useful for other kinds of cancer. They can't get an expanded access request approved for that reason. So that, to loop back to the preventative stuff, the problem that you will have is that in clinical trials, things like personalized cancer vaccines are always administered after the tumor has been removed, right? And at that point, again, once the tumor has been removed, you're no longer technically terminal. So is there some sort of like, kind of clever way where you could like maybe cut out half the tumor and then administer it and then like immediately cut out the rest. Maybe on paper, but again, you just get into the reality of the situation that like the biotechs are not going to risk trying to do a runaround on the FDA like that. Right? That's why more flexible protocols at the state level have their role and are needed to ensure patient access. And it's why you should not box in treatment access based on patient qualifications.
Yes, agreed. And thank you for that explanation. And now we come to the point in our salon where essentially we give our guests the opportunity to sum things up. Any final remarks that you would like to offer to our viewers? Anything else you would like them to know? And what do you anticipate happening in the near future that could move the field forward if the meeting with the FDA is a success?
Sure. So to answer that last question, if meeting with the FDA is a success, if we get what we want, this time, maybe in a month from now, any American and even anybody across the world will be able to come to Montana and access the kind of cutting edge cancer care that billionaires usually fly overseas to get, and it will not cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. It will be affordable. It won't be cheap, but it will be affordable. In terms of what I'd like to leave everybody with, we are always seeking more allies. We are always seeking people who have some sort of connection with patients. Patient stories are enormously valuable for us. We're always seeking people who have connections to biotechs that qualify anybody post phase 1, even if the phase 1 was done in another country. And we're always just generally trying to get in touch with people who really are willing to spend 5 to 10 minutes calling their representative and just telling them like, hey, this is important to me. It really does make a difference. So my contact info is at the bottom of this slide. My email, my phone number. Probably best way to reach me actually is on Twitter, X now, I guess. We are open to it. I can't always promise that we're going to have everything we want or that you want, but if you would like to help, if you would like to be a voice in favor of this movement, we are at the finish line now. We are close, and we every little voice helps in just tipping us over that threshold. So please feel free to reach out to me, and thanks everybody for taking the time to listen.
Yes, thank you very much, Stephen. This was a fascinating presentation, a great conversation that ensued, and yes, we are close in this effort. Thank you to you for your advocacy so that we can all live long and prosper.
All right. Have a good day, everybody.
You do as well.